Every beautiful rose has its thorns, and every velvet story has a sharp edge of reality that cuts deep. Experience the delicate balance of beauty and pain in our latest series of moving human dramas. Hit subscribe now and feel every nuance of the cinematic journey.
My hands would not stop shaking. I pressed them flat against the white linen tablecloth, feeling the cold stiffness of it under my palms, and I told myself to breathe. The candlelight flickered across the crystal glasses. The sommelier was somewhere behind me. My boss, my former boss, the woman who had mentored me for 4 years and flown in from Seattle just for tonight, was sitting directly across from me, smiling, completely unaware that the woman now pulling out the chair next to her had not been invited. My mother-in-law sat down like she owned the table. She did not look at me when she sat. She looked at the menu. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this story. I want you to understand who I was before that dinner. Because the woman I was 6 months ago would have swallowed everything I am about to tell you. She would have smiled. She would have handed over her credit card with both hands. She would have told herself that keeping the peace was the same thing as having dignity. I was 31 years old, and I had been keeping the peace for 4 years. My name is Rebecca. I am a senior financial analyst at a logistics firm in Chicago, and 8 weeks before this dinner happened, I was promoted to Director of Strategic Planning. It was the kind of promotion that does not happen at 31. It was the kind that makes people in conference rooms go quiet when your name is announced. My mentor, Carol, the woman who had spotted something in me at a conference in 2021 and spent the next 4 years opening every door she could reach, had called me from Seattle at 7 in the morning to say, "I always knew it would be you." I booked the dinner 2 weeks in advance. Monteverde on West Fulton, a table for 3, me, my husband Daniel, and Carol. I chose the date carefully because Carol had a layover in Chicago on her way back from a client visit in New York. 2.5 hours. That was all we had. I made the reservation for 7:30, confirmed it twice, and told Daniel to be there by 7:15. I did not tell my mother-in-law. Why would I? It was not her promotion. It was not her mentor. It was a dinner for 3 people, at a restaurant with a tasting menu that started at $240 per person, and I had planned every detail of it myself. At 6:58, Carol texted me that she had landed and was in a cab. I was already at the restaurant, standing at the bar with a glass of sparkling water, wearing the navy dress I had bought specifically for this night. Daniel was parking the car. I felt the kind of happiness that lives in your chest and makes everything slightly warmer, the kind you do not let yourself feel too often because you are afraid of what it means if it gets taken from you. At 7:11, Daniel walked in. Behind him, his mother walked in. Behind her, his 2 sisters walked in. I stood very still at that bar. I watched them come through the door in a little group, my mother-in-law already scanning the room with the specific expression she always wore in nice places. The one that was not quite wonder and not quite disdain, but somehow both at the same time. She was wearing a silk blouse I had never seen before. His sisters, Tanya and Brienne, were dressed like they had somewhere important to be. Daniel caught my eye across the room and gave me a look I recognized immediately. It was the look he gave me when he already knew he had done something wrong and was hoping his face could negotiate the consequences before his mouth had to. My mother-in-law spotted me, raised her hand in a little wave, and smiled with every tooth she had. I set my sparkling water down on the bar very carefully. I picked up my phone. I texted Carol, still on for 7:30. Table is reserved under Rebecca. Then I walked across the restaurant toward my husband. I will tell you about my mother-in-law now, because you need to know who she is before you can understand what happened at that table. Her name is Diane. She is 63 years old, and she has been the gravitational center of the Harmon family since long before I entered it. She is not loud. That is the thing people always get wrong about women like her. They expect loud. Diane is soft-spoken, impeccably dressed, and she has a gift for making every generous thing you do for yourself feel like something that should have been offered to her first. When Daniel and I got married 4 years ago, we received envelopes at the reception. Cash, checks, gift cards. Standard. Beautiful. At the end of the night, Diane offered to hold on to the envelopes for safekeeping while we said goodbye to the last guests. It was a thoughtful gesture. We were distracted. We said yes. We never received those envelopes. When I asked Daniel about it 2 weeks later, he went quiet in the way he goes quiet when the answer is something he does not want to say out loud. Eventually, he told me his mother had mentioned holding some of it in reserve for us. He said he would talk to her. He talked to her. He talked to her. She told him the money had gone towards some of the wedding costs she had covered. We had never asked her to cover anything. We had never received an itemized list. The total, she implied, was vague and shifting and always just slightly higher than any number we could argue with. We had received cards and letters from 37 guests. We knew the envelopes existed. The total, based on what people told us later they had given, was somewhere near $4,000. It was gone. Daniel said, "She's my mother. What do you want me to do?" I said nothing because I had not yet learned the words for what I wanted him to do. I filed it somewhere in the back of my chest, and I kept the peace, and I told myself it was done and over. It was not done and over. It was not done and over. It never is, with women like Diane. You do not get one incident. You get a pattern, and each individual piece of it is just small enough that you question whether you are being fair. In the 3 years that followed, she borrowed Daniel's truck for a week and returned it with the front bumper damaged and a vague story about a parking garage. She asked me to look over her taxes as a favor, and the favor turned into 4 weekends of my time. She called Daniel every Sunday at 9 in the morning, which was fine, except that we had a standing agreement with my own family for Sunday breakfast, and Daniel started canceling it because his mother's calls ran long. When I pointed this out, he said I was keeping score. Maybe I was keeping score, but someone had to. So when Daniel walked through the door of Monteverde at 7-Eleven with his mother and his 2 sisters behind him, I understood immediately that this had not been spontaneous. Diane had known about this dinner. Daniel had told her, and somewhere in the conversation between them, it had been decided that showing up was easier than asking, because asking might result in a no. I pulled Daniel aside near the host stand. His sisters drifted toward the bar. His mother stood in the middle of the restaurant and looked at the room as if appraising it. "What is happening right now?" I said. I kept my voice completely level. "They were already in the city," he said. "Tanya had a thing downtown, and they ended up near here, and I mentioned we were coming, and Mom really wanted to meet Carol." "Carol is my mentor," I said. "This is my dinner. I made a reservation for 3 people. Rebecca, I made a reservation for 3 people, Daniel." He put his hand on my arm. "It's one dinner. It's a celebration, right? The more the merrier. The more the merrier." 4 years of keeping the peace had been leading up to that phrase, and something in me heard it land and did not reach out to catch it. I looked at my husband. I looked at my mother-in-law, who had now located our table and was moving toward it with the confidence of someone who had been expected. I thought about the $4,000. I thought about the 4 weekends of my time. I thought about every Sunday breakfast I had sat through alone because his mother's calls ran long. Then I thought about Carol, who was in a cab right now, who had flown across the country for a layover just to sit across a table from me and celebrate the thing I had worked 4 years to become. I straightened my dress. I walked to the table. I sat down. Diane was already seated. She had taken the chair across from mine, the chair I had mentally reserved for Carol. She had opened her menu. She was reading it with the expression of someone who had earned the right to be there. I picked up my own menu. I said nothing. Carol arrived at 7:28, which is exactly the kind of person Carol is. She came through the door in a charcoal blazer with her silver hair and her posture that makes rooms pay attention to her, and when she saw me, her face opened into something so genuinely warm that I had to look down at my menu for a second to keep my own face steady. I stood up. We hugged. I introduced her to Daniel, which was easy. Then I introduced her to Diane, which was the sentence I had not planned on needing to say. "And this is my mother-in-law, Diane, and my sisters-in-law, Tanya and Brienne." I paused just briefly enough for Carol to process that there were now 6 people at a table that had been reserved for 3. They were in the area. Carol, who has spent 30 years in corporate environments and has a PhD in reading rooms, said, "How lovely," with exactly the right amount of warmth and exactly the right amount of nothing else. She sat down in the remaining open chair, which was between Tanya and Daniel, which meant she was diagonally across from me instead of directly across, which meant the dinner I had imagined. Just the 3 of us. Carol and me talking about the next 5 years of my career while Daniel listened and smiled, was already a different dinner than the one I was sitting at. We ordered drinks. Carol asked for still water and the wine list. Diane asked the sommelier to explain the bottle service options from the top. The sommelier, who was young and professional and doing his absolute best, began explaining. I watched Diane listen to him the way I had watched her listen to the tax code when I was helping with her returns, with total focus, with the face of someone who was going to need the most expensive version of what was being described. She ordered a bottle of Barolo. I want to be precise, she did not ask if anyone wanted wine. She did not suggest we share something. She turned to the sommelier and said, "We'll have the 2018 Barolo," and he wrote it down and left, and Diane returned to her menu as if the decision had been entirely casual. The 2018 Barolo on that list was $190. That is to say, the table, had not discussed wine. Carol had asked for the wine list for herself. I had planned to order a single glass of something with dinner. Daniel does not drink. Tanya and Brienne, I would learn, planned to drink as much of the Barolo as Diane would allow. I looked at Carol. Carol was looking at the menu with the deliberate focus of someone who has decided to be gracious. I looked at Daniel. Daniel was looking at his phone. I picked up my menu and I read it from top to bottom with great care. I was doing something I had started doing in the months before this night. Something I called, privately, getting very quiet and very clear. When you get very quiet and very clear, you stop reacting to the surface of things and you start seeing the full picture. The full picture at this table was not complicated. Diane had arrived at my celebration dinner without an invitation and had ordered a $190 bottle of wine for a table she had not been invited to join, at a restaurant where the tasting menu was $240 per person, and she had done it within 7 minutes of sitting down. The question was not whether this was happening, the question was how it would end. I knew how it would end if I did nothing. I had done nothing before. I knew the shape of that ending. The bill would arrive, and there would be a pause, and Diane would look at Daniel, and Daniel would look at me, and the silence would fill with 4 years of kept peace, and I would hand the server my card, and I would pay for a dinner I had not invited anyone to, at a cost I had not budgeted for, in a dress I had bought for a completely different night, and Carol would be in a capsule hair before any of it was resolved. I was not going to do nothing. The tasting menu proceeded. 7 courses. Carol and I managed to carve out something real between the plates. She asked me about my first strategic priorities. I told her about the infrastructure gap I had already identified. She leaned across the table and said, "That is exactly the right thing to be looking at." And I felt, for a few minutes at a time, like the dinner I had planned. Diane interjected twice with comments about Daniel's childhood, which was, I was certain, not an accident. Tanya and Brienne took pictures of every course. The Barolo was finished by the 5th course. Diane asked the sommelier about a second bottle. He described one. She said, "Yes, that one." The second bottle was $220. I watched it happen. I let it happen. I was getting very quiet and very clear. At the end of the 7th course, when the dessert plates had been cleared and the server appeared with the kind of neutral, professional expression that means the bill is about to become a conversation, I did something I had rehearsed in my mind for the previous 4 hours without knowing I was rehearsing it. I spoke first. I said calmly and without any particular emphasis, "Actually, could we please get separate checks? I'd like mine to cover seats 1 and 2 at this end, myself and my guest Carol, and the rest of the table on a separate check." The server said, "Of course." He wrote something down. He left. It was 11 words. 11 words and a point of my finger, and the evening reorganized itself around them. The silence at the table lasted approximately 3 seconds, which is a very long time when 6 people are all pretending not to be listening. Carol looked at me. She had the small, composed expression of someone who understood exactly what had just happened and was choosing to look at her dessert spoon. Daniel looked at me. His expression was different. It was the look of a man watching a bridge he thought was solid turn out to be something else entirely. Diane looked up from her coffee cup very slowly. She looked at me the way she had looked at the restaurant when she walked in, appraising, recalibrating, searching for the angle. "Rebecca," she said with a small laugh that was not a laugh. "Don't be silly. We're family." "I know," I said. "I just want to make sure everything's organized." There is something I have noticed about the word family when Diane uses it. It is never used in moments of warmth or ease. It is deployed specifically in moments when money is about to change hands. It is a word that is meant to make the person on the receiving end feel that objecting would be a moral failure. I had heard it before the tax weekends. I had heard it after the wedding envelopes. I heard it after the wedding envelopes. I heard it now, and I felt it try to find its usual perches on me, and I felt it not find any. "I'd actually love to catch up a little more with Carol before she has to leave," I said, which was true, and which also ended the conversation without ending it unpleasantly. Diane turned to Daniel. What happened next I only partly saw, because I was turned toward Carol, asking about her next project in Seattle. But I heard it in the register of sound that happens at a table when a private conversation is meant to stay private but isn't quite. I heard Diane's voice, low and textured with the specific calm she used when she was not calm. I heard Daniel say something in a murmur. I heard Diane say just a little louder, "It's not appropriate, Daniel." The server returned with 2 checks and 2 folding presenters. He placed one in front of me and one in the center of the remaining 4 seats. I opened mine without drama. I put my card in without looking at the total, which I already knew because I had been tracking it in my head since the menu. My dinner plus Carol's dinner plus a glass of champagne each, and the tip came to $512. I had budgeted for it. I budgeted for it 2 weeks ago because that is what planning looks like. The other check contained the 2 bottles of wine plus 4 tasting menus. I did not see the number, but I had done the math. It was somewhere north of $1,200. Diane opened the presenter. I watched her face in my peripheral vision. I had gotten very quiet and very clear, and in that state I was able to watch things without reacting to them in real time, the way you can watch weather through a window. She closed the presenter. She opened her purse. She produced a credit card with the deliberate motion of someone doing something they considered unnecessary, and she placed it on top of the check. The server took it. I signed my own receipt. I put my copy in my clutch. Carol had her coat on and was checking her phone. Her cab was 4 minutes away. We stood up together, and she put both hands on my shoulders and looked at me with the expression she had used at the end of particularly important meetings, the one that meant you did something right tonight without saying it. "I'm so proud of you, Rebecca," she said. "I mean that." I walked her to the door. We said goodbye on the sidewalk. She got in her cab. I watched it pull away from the curb on West Fulton, and I stood there in the November cold in my navy dress, and I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt like myself, the full size of myself, not a smaller version that fit more easily into other people's expectations. I went back inside. The server had returned Diane's card. She was holding it. Daniel was looking at the table. Tanya and Brienne were suddenly very interested in their coats. Diane looked at me when I sat down. The appraising look had changed into something I did not have an immediate word for. It was not anger exactly, and it was not hurt. It was the expression of someone recalculating, which meant I had disrupted something she had calculated in advance. "That was unnecessary," she said. "I thought it was pretty straightforward," I said. "We are your family. You are Daniel's family," I said, without heat, without rush. "I love you all very much, and I'm really glad you got to meet Carol. But this dinner was planned as something specific, and I wanted to honor that. You made us feel like strangers." I thought about that for a moment. I thought about the wedding envelopes, the bumper, the tax returns, the Sunday breakfasts, the $190 Barolo ordered without asking, the second bottle at $220. I thought about Daniel, who was still looking at the table, who had not yet looked at me, who had told his mother about a dinner he knew was not hers to attend. "I didn't make anyone feel anything," I said. "I asked for separate checks. That's a pretty common thing to do." Diane stood up. She folded her coat over her arm with great precision, and she looked at me with the recalibrated look, and she said, "We'll talk about this," which was meant to sound like a threat and instead sounded like a promise I was no longer afraid of. She and Tanya and Brienne left. Daniel and I sat alone at the table for the first time all night. He was quiet for a long time. I let him be quiet. I picked up my water glass and I drank the rest of it, and I looked at the room, which was still beautiful, which was still full of candlelight and crystal and people celebrating things, and I thought about Carol in a cab to O'Hare, and I felt the navy dress and what it had been bought for. And I thought, this is what it feels like to not swallow it. "You could have just paid," Daniel said. "It wasn't worth all that." I looked at him. He was not a bad man. I want to be clear about that because the story is easier if he is a villain, and he was not. He was a man who had been taught since childhood that the path of least resistance ran straight through his wife's patience, and he had walked it for 4 years without looking down at what it was paved with. "How much did your mother spend tonight?" I asked. He didn't answer. "Over $1,200, I said. "In 2 bottles of wine she ordered without asking, at a dinner she wasn't invited to impress my mentor with my accomplishment." I paused. "That's the inheritance from my wedding reception, Daniel. She spent it tonight, on herself, at my table." He said nothing. "I'm not angry," I said, which was true. I had moved past anger several courses ago, somewhere around the second Barolo. "I'm just done paying for things I didn't choose." We drove home mostly in silence. Not the bad kind of silence, not the silence that comes after a fight. The silence that comes after something has finally been said out loud. I know you're sitting with some version of this right now. I know because I sat with it for 4 years. The person who takes and takes and takes from you and uses the language of love and family like a key that was specifically cut to open your resistance. The holiday you paid for and they took credit for. The money that disappeared in a gray area of someone else's accounting. The Sunday mornings that were carved away a half hour at a time until they were gone. And I know the thing underneath all of it, which is that the person enabling it is not always the one you think of as the villain. Sometimes it is the person who sleeps next to you. Sometimes it is the person who knows exactly what is being taken from you and tells you that naming it out loud is the problem. 11 words. That is all it was. Could we please get separate checks? Spoken calmly at the right moment, directly to the person whose job it was to act on them. Not to Diane, not to Daniel. Not in the hallway in a whispered negotiation that would already have conceded the outcome. Here is what I have learned. You cannot negotiate at the table. By the time you are negotiating at the table, you have already handed over the authority you needed. The only thing that works is a quiet, specific, practical action taken before the negotiation begins. Separate checks. Itemized bills. The question asked of the server, not of the person who is trying to eat at your expense. And here is the harder thing. The Barolo was not really about Barolo. The wedding envelopes were not really about money. These things were about the question of whether I was someone who had enough of herself left to protect, or someone who had been fully converted into a resource. I had the answer now. It had cost me 11 words and nothing else. 3 weeks after that dinner, Daniel and I had a long conversation, the kind we had been circling for 2 years, the kind that required the dinner to happen first before either of us knew we were ready to have it. It was honest in a way that was not comfortable and necessary in a way that was not optional. He told me things about growing up in that house that I had suspected and never been given. I told him things about the last 4 years that I had never said out loud. It was not a good conversation. It was an important one. Diane has not brought up the dinner. She brings up other things, smaller things, the kind that are just below the threshold you would call a pattern if you are not already paying attention. But I am paying attention now, in a way I was not before. And if you are sitting there right now recognizing something I just described, if you are the person at a table you booked, wearing the dress you chose, watching someone reach across it and take the credit, I want you to know that the words exist. They are 11 of them, or fewer, depending on your situation. You just have to say them before the check arrives. What happened to me at that dinner table was not an accident, and I do not mean that in the way people sometimes mean it, the resigned shrug, that's just how she is. I mean it in the most precise sense. Every single thing that happened that night was the result of choices. Diane's choices, yes, but also mine. Every time I had absorbed a cost I did not agree to, I had taught someone that the cost would be absorbed. Every time I had stayed silent in the hallway negotiation, I had confirmed that silence was the same as consent. The $4,000 from our wedding envelopes did not disappear because Diane was bold enough to take it. It disappeared because I was not yet clear enough to name what was happening while it was happening. That is the thing nobody tells you about patterns like this. They do not begin with a dramatic theft. They begin with something small enough to let go of, and the letting go teaches the other person exactly how much they can take next time. By the time Rebecca was sitting at a table she had reserved and paid for, wearing a dress she had chosen for a specific night, watching a woman order a second bottle of wine without asking, the foundation for that moment had been built across 4 years of small, quiet lessons in the wrong direction. This is what I mean when I say the night at Monteverde was not about wine. It was about the cumulative weight of every time I had chosen comfort over clarity. And the reason 11 words were enough to change everything is that real authority does not require volume. It does not require confrontation or an audience or a perfectly crafted speech. It requires only that you act before the moment has already been decided for you, that you speak to the person who has the actual power to change the outcome, not to the person who is hoping you won't. Wisdom is not knowing what to say in a difficult moment. Wisdom is having paid enough attention to your own life that the difficult moment no longer catches you off guard. I spent 4 years catching things off guard. The dinner was the night I stopped. And the courage it took was not the dramatic kind. It was the quiet kind, the kind that looks like a woman calmly calling over a server and asking for itemized bills, the kind that other people at the table might not even recognize as courage until later, when they are sitting alone with the check they ordered and the decisions they made. I am not at the end of the story. Daniel and I are still working through what the last 4 years actually looked like when we stopped being polite about it. Diane still calls on Sundays. Some things do not resolve cleanly, and I think it is dishonest to suggest they do. but I am someone different now than the woman who sat at that bar at 6:58 with her sparkling water and her carefully planned evening and her deep, trained instinct to make room for everyone else at her own table. The check was always going to come. The only question was always who was going to pay it.